I was sitting in the family room watching my favorite old crime show, the kind with slow voices and soft music. My knees were wrapped in a blanket and my tea was still warm. For a moment, everything felt calm. Then, my son-in-law, Mark, walked in. Without even looking at me, he reached for the remote and switched off the television. "Go to your room, old woman," he said. "This living room is mine now." My daughter, Sarah, stood behind him in the doorway. Her hands were folded in front of her, her eyes were down. She said nothing. That silence hurt more than his words. I looked at the blank, black screen where my show had been playing. I felt something inside me break. Not loudly, not with anger. It broke quietly, like glass cracking under pressure. I stood up slowly. My joints ached, but my back was straight. I picked up my keys from the table. I did not say a word to Mark. I did not look at him. I walked past my daughter. I opened the front door and left the house that I had paid for with 30 years of work. The rain was already falling when I reached my car. I sat there for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel. That house was not just walls and a roof. It was my life. I bought it after my husband died. I raised my daughter there. I planted the roses in the front yard with my own hands. And now, a man who had never paid a single mortgage payment had just told me to go to my room. Mark always had a way of making himself feel big by making others feel small. He smiled when he insulted people. He laughed when they looked hurt. He believed age meant weakness. He believed silence meant surrender. He was wrong. He had no idea who I really was. I did not drive far. I parked 2 blocks away where I could still see the house. The lights were on. Mark was probably already sitting in my chair. I took out my phone and called my lawyer. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to do something tonight," I said. An hour later, I was sitting across from him in his office. I placed the original house deed on his desk. I also placed the signed agreement that Mark had signed when he moved in. He had signed it without reading it. He always thought rules were for other people. The agreement clearly stated that he was a guest with no legal rights to the home. My lawyer smiled. "We can serve him an eviction notice by morning," he said. I nodded. "Do it." I did not cry. I did not shout. I just waited. The next morning, a man in a crisp gray suit rang the doorbell. Mark opened the door, smiling. That smile disappeared when he saw the papers. "Notice of eviction," the man said calmly. Mark tried to argue. He tried to shout, but the law was not listening. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Sarah. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "Mom, please come back," she said. "We can talk about this." "You never lost your home," I told her. "You just forgot whose name was on the deed." I drove back just as a moving truck arrived. Mark was throwing his expensive shoes into boxes. He looked wild, angry, afraid. Sarah was sitting on the stairs holding her phone. She looked small, like a scared child. Mark screamed at me from the porch. "You are heartless," he said. "You are cruel." I rolled down my window. "Respect is the rent you pay to live under my roof," I said, "and you never paid a single day." The rain poured down as they loaded the truck. I walked back inside. The living room was quiet, warm, mine. I picked up the remote and turned the TV back on. For the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful. The sun was setting over the hills of Virginia, casting long golden shadows across the mahogany floor. The sun was setting over the hills of Virginia, casting long golden shadows across the mahogany floors of the home I had built with my own hands and my own savings. I sat in my favorite armchair, watching the evening news, just as I had done every night for 20 years. The flickering blue light was the only thing filling the room until a heavy hand reached out and pressed the power button. The screen went black with a sharp, clinical click that echoed through the hallways. "Go to your room," my son-in-law Mark snapped. His voice was tight and arrogant, full of a misplaced authority he had not earned. "This house is mine now." he said while leaning against the doorframe, trying to look taller than he actually was. I did not look at him immediately. Instead, I turned my gaze to my daughter, Sarah, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. She was clutching a dish towel, her knuckles white and her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. She said nothing. The air in the room felt thick with her betrayal. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice because I knew something they had both forgotten in their greed and their rush to inherit a life they had not built. I stood up slowly, feeling the ache in my knees, and took my car keys from the bowl by the front door. I walked out into the cool night air and listened to the heavy thud of the door locking behind me. Mark thought he had won a kingdom, but he had really just trapped himself in a cage of his own making. What he did not know was this: the house was paid off 12 years ago by me with the life insurance policy from my late husband and the dividends from a career in corporate law. I had never transferred the title. I had only let them move in to help them get on their feet after his failed business venture. In their minds, my kindness had become a permanent surrender, but in the eyes of the law, they were nothing more than guests who had overstayed their welcome. I spent the night at a quiet hotel downtown and met with my attorney at 7 in the morning while the city was still waking up. We did not file for a long mediation or a family discussion. We filed for an immediate termination of all third-party access to my accounts and my property. I told the lawyer that power does not need to shout, it simply needs to disconnect. By the next day, a lawyer knocked on the front door while Mark was likely sitting in my chair dreaming of how he would remodel the basement. He was handed a stack of papers that detailed his status as a trespasser. By that evening, the high-speed internet was shut off because the account was in my name and I had called the provider to report the service move. By nightfall, Mark stood at the local grocery store with a cart full of expensive steak and wine, only to find that the shared credit card he had been using for months was declined at the register. The system I had built to support them was a complex web of payments and permissions, and I began to untangle every thread with a single phone call. One by one, the lights of his artificial life went out. He called me 40 times that night, but I did not answer a single one. I sat on the hotel balcony watching the city lights and realized that silence is the most powerful weapon a mother has when her respect is discarded. 30 hours after I left, I returned to the house with a sheriff and a locksmith. Mark was standing on the lawn, his face red with a mixture of fury and embarrassment, while Sarah stood behind him, weeping into her hands. I did not look at the suitcases on the grass. I walked past them into my foyer and felt the familiar warmth of the wood floors under my feet. Mark tried to scream that I was heartless and that family does not treat family this way, but I simply pointed to the empty TV stand. "You told me to go to my room," I said softly, as the locksmith began changing the tumblers on the front door. I decided to take the whole house instead, because respect is the only currency I accept in this home, and you are officially. The golden afternoon sun of Georgia filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the living room, casting long amber stripes across the Persian rug I had bought in a small shop in Istanbul 30 years ago. I was sitting in my favorite wingback chair, the one with the worn armrests where my late husband used to sit and read the Sunday paper. I was watching a documentary about the Great Barrier Reef, trying to find some peace in the silent blue of the underwater footage. Suddenly, the screen went dark with a sharp electronic click that felt like a slap to the face. My son-in-law, David, stood there holding the remote control with a smug grin on his face. He had his feet kicked up on the hand-carved coffee cable that had been an anniversary gift from my father. "Go to your room, old woman," he said, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "This living room is mine now. In fact, the whole house is mine now, so you might as well get used to the upstairs view." I looked over at my daughter, Elena.
She was standing by the bookshelf, pretending to organize the novels I knew she had never read. She wouldn't look at me. Her silence was a physical weight in the room, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I waited for her to say something, to tell him he was being disrespectful, or to remind him whose name was etched into the stone gate at the end of the driveway. She said nothing. She just tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and kept her eyes on the floor. I did not argue, I did not cry, I did not raise my voice, because I have learned over 65 years that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least amount of real power. I simply stood up, smoothed the wrinkles in my silk skirt, and picked up my leather purse from the side table. I walked out of the front door without looking back, and the sound of the heavy oak closing behind me felt like the end of a long and exhausting chapter in a book I was tired of reading. I spent the night at a luxury hotel near the harbor, the kind of place where the sheets are crisp and the staff understands the value of discretion. I sat by the window, watching the lights of the city, and I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, the second was to the bank, and the third was to a private security firm. I had spent decades building a legacy of grace and kindness, but David had mistaken my gentleness for fragility. He had forgotten that I was the one who managed the estate and the trust and the very air he breathed inside those 4 walls. The next morning, the air was crisp and the birds were singing in the magnolias when a sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit rang the doorbell of my home. David was likely still in his pajamas, probably sitting on my sofa and eating from my kitchen, when he shouted from the couch, "Who is it?" The man in the suit did not flinch. "Legal notice," he replied, his voice calm and professional. David opened the door, expecting perhaps a delivery or a friend, but he was met with a stack of papers that carried the weight of the state Supreme Court. It was a formal notice to vacate. David began to stammer, his face turning a shade of red that matched the bricks of the chimney he thought he owned. He tried to claim that the house was part of his inheritance, but the papers clearly stated that the property was held in a private discretionary trust of which I was the sole executor and primary beneficiary. The man in the suit explained that their status as guests had been revoked effective immediately, and they had exactly 30 days to remove their belongings before the locks were changed and the property was placed under 24-hour surveillance. By that evening, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. The high-speed internet was gone, the premium cable channels were black, and the climate control system had been locked at a very uncomfortable temperature from my phone app. David and Elena sat in a darkened kitchen eating takeout because the grocery delivery accounts had been frozen. That night, Elena finally called me. Her voice was trembling, and I could hear the sound of her husband pacing and cursing in the background. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked me through the phone. "Why did you just walk out like that without a word?" I could hear the tears in her voice, and for a moment the old motherly instinct to comfort her flared up in my heart. But then I remembered her eyes on the floorboards while her husband insulted me in my own home. I didn't need to say anything, I told her softly, because when you own the foundation, you don't need to shout at the people standing on the roof. You forgot that this house was never a gift, it was a privilege, and privileges are earned through respect, not demanded through arrogance. You never lost your home, Elena. You just forgot whose name was on the deed, and now you have 30 days to remember where you actually belong.